I'd just like to welcome Dr. Debbie Goldgaber then to this seminar for the Centre for Continental Philosophy. Debbie's the author of Speculative Grammatology, Deconstruction and New Materialism, which came out last year with Edinburgh University Press, and which I'm very much looking forward to reading. Now I've realised it's finally out. And the paper she's giving today is Ancestral Events and Posthumous Texts Towards a Grammatological Account of Evidence. Okay, thank you, Debbie.
Thank you so much, Henry, for this invitation. And though the screen you're looking at doesn't share the same title, it really just means the same thing. So grammatological evidence is, I'm going to call absolute evidence. If I'm using Derridian language, I would say grammatological or textual. If I'm using Mayo-Suian language, I would say absolute or non-correlational. And this is from the second chapter of Speculative Grammatology. And I'm not reading from that, but I'm including most of the sort of argument from there, just in a different form that I think is more, is easier to convey in a talk and live. And I've tried to use these slides to keep you engaged and attentive, but also to allow you to read along for some of the quotes that I'll be looking at. What else can I say? Oh, yes, I have emailed Henry the chapter from Speculative Grammatology. So he has a PDF. So he can automatically pass it on to folks, or you can just email him. And I've included my email at the end of the presentation in case you want to be in touch. Always love to hear from people. And while you can reserve your questions for the end, if there's any pressing question, feel free to, I don't know, pop in and ask at any point. Okay, so absolute evidence, Derrida, Mayo-Suian, and the critique of correlationism. I want to start with a quote, which I meant to put in but forgot. And this is A.J. Ayers from Philosophy in the 20th Century. And he writes, "For my own part, I think that if one were looking for a single phrase to capture the stage to which philosophy has progressed," that's a very analytic view that philosophy progresses. For a single phrase to capture the stage to which philosophy has progressed, the study of evidence would be a better choice than the study of language. And I will argue that this is true for Derrida's grammatological project, which has often been construed as some account of language, and I want to say it's better construed as an account of evidence. Okay, so we're going to look at two critiques of correlationism, and the term is Mayo-Sui's, and it comes from After Finitude, published in English in 2007. We're going to look at a few quotes, and the second one would be Dan Zahavi finds an earlier usage of this term correlationism. For Mayo-Suian, correlationism is kind of used pejoratively as this philosophical position we're stuck in, where it's always going to be a question of access, it's always going to be a question of epistemology over ontology. Dan Zahavi locates an earlier use of this term. And I'm going to argue that, or I do argue that Derrida's idea of the metaphysics of presence, perhaps it's reductive to say this, but I think it's reductive in a clarifying way, that among other things that metaphysics of presence points to is it's a critique of what Mayo-Suian calls correlationism, though this is rarely recognized. So Derrida, I argue in the book, is doing a critique of correlationism avant la lettre, and that it's interesting to read Mayo-Suian's critique of correlationism and Derrida's critique together. I think that we'll see that they're mutually illuminating. So, okay, let's look at a few quotes. Here's the Max Beck quote that Zahavi digs up. He's actually defending correlationism, which isn't surprising because he's a Husserlian, and Husserl is really the poster child of correlationism. So correlationism can here serve as the term for a position developed by Husserl and Dilthey, according to which the old alternative between idealism or realism, subjectivism or objectivism, philosophy of immanence and phenomenalism, or philosophy of the real, must be overcome in favor of the following negative claim: neither does a world in itself exist independently of consciousness, nor does only consciousness or a conscious subject exist, and the world merely as a mode of consciousness or the subject. Neither do we know the world as it is in itself, nor do we merely know an illusory world behind which the real true world exists in itself. The positive counter-thesis of correlationism is the following: consciousness and world, subject and object, I and world stand in a correlative, mutually dependent context of being, such that the disjunctions mentioned above are meaningless. And I think that's the important takeaway, that the correlationism does not allow us to speak of the disjunctions of the correlation independentely, and to do so would be meaningless. So Meillassoux basically just rewrites that. I don't think wittingly, but he rewrites Beck's positive thesis. The central notion of modern philosophy after Kant seems to be that of correlation. By correlation, we mean the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. We will henceforth call correlationism any current of thought which maintains the unsurpassable character of the correlation so defined. Consequently, it becomes possible to say that every philosophy which disavows naive realism has become a variant of correlationism. And again, I'm saying that Derrida's idea of metaphysics of presence is, at least includes this idea of correlationism. Derrida writes in Speech and Phenomena that metaphysics of presence is refers to the ultimate philosophical value of presence, defined as the present form of experience, originary intuition, or the form of ideality. Metaphysics of presence is repeated in phenomenology's principle of all principles, which places the ultimate value on, and it's the starting point, it's the alpha and omega. Givenness is the ultimate value for phenomenology, which refers to evidentness, present presence of an originary intuition to consciousness. And Derrida sees Western philosophy as a ceaseless repetition, a reformulation of this metaphysics of presence, or what Meillassoux refers to as correlationism, though he dates it to post-Kantian philosophy. All right, so so we're talking about two critiques of correlationism, and the two critiques of correlationism are motivated by what I call two extra correlational or extra transcendental instances. It would probably be more clarifying to call it extra correlational instances. So the critique of correlationism is going to offer you two extra correlational instances, two structures or objects or events that you cannot possibly understand in correlational terms. And this is supposed to motivate the correlationists to revise, more or less radically, their views. And for Meillassoux, this extra correlational instance he refers to as ancestral events. And he's a little bit hedgy on whether and how what he calls archifossils, which refer to these events, whether these are extra correlational or not. But certainly ancestral events are, and we'll talk about what those are in a minute. And I argue posthumous texts, Derrida's notion of texts and the radical absence of any possible readers, this too is an extra correlational instance. We will not be able to understand or explain the structure of textuality within a correlational framework. So I think about these as thought experiments, and I think that they have the same function, same-ish function. They challenge correlationism by positing something, an event, ancestral events, or structure, a text, that escapes in principle correlationist ontology, because these cannot be defined in terms of any transcendental activity. Now, these events are defined by the absence of transcendental activity, like they're posited like right away as not having any possible correlate. So before I explain a little bit more about what those are, I want to just say a little bit about my reading strategy. I think that, because I think you have, why are you comparing two authors or two philosophers? I mean, it's interesting, I guess, that they both have a critique of correlationism, but I think that it's productive philosophically to read them together. I think that the thought experiments and the frameworks are mutually illuminating. Meillassoux critique of correlationism, I believe, illuminates in hindsight one of the meanings of Derrida's critique of metaphysics of presence, and one that has been missed, I think. Because Derrida is often seen as a correlationist himself, somebody who's insisting on the impossibility of getting at the world because of all sorts of linguistic mediations and textual mediations. So he's often read as a correlationist. So it's, I think, refreshing to read him as a critique of correlationism. Derrida's account of textuality and his critique of indication or indicative evidence in speech and phenomena offer, I argue, a crucial corrective to Meillassoux' account of ancestral evidence. So I think that reading these together will help us push Meillassoux away from this focus on an event and cause us to look closely at this idea of evidence, ancestral evidence that's meant to point to these events. Reading each in light of the other gives an account of absolute or grammatological evidence, where absolute evidence is that which does not depend on recognition or the inferential activity of the knower. Okay, so this is Meillassoux. We'll look at his idea of ancestral events first. So their ancestral events are pure posits. The ancestral events are anything that occurs outside of the horizon of a knower, an embodied knower, any possible experiencer. So anything will count as an ancestral event that is in principle unwitnessable because there were no witnesses around, right? And he argues that the transcendental subject, though we don't want to confuse the transcendental subject with any empirical subject or body, nevertheless requires like life, like carbon-based life, in order to instantiate the transcendental subject. So that's kind of the basic background of his claim. So ancestral events are just those events that are in principle unwitnessable. And one example might be the accretion of the planet Earth. I think it's 3.5 billion years ago. Maybe it's 5.3. So that's an example of an ancestral event. Nobody was there to witness it. And so ancient Earth, right, is an ancestral event. And Meillassoux believes that the correlationist will want to be able to, or at least some correlationists will want to have a realist understanding or account of these events, but won't be able to on their own grounds. Remember what Beck said, it's meaningless to talk of one without the other. So in principle, a priori, you cannot do that. And so this is a unique problem for a correlationist, but it's of course not a problem for anybody else. So it's interesting to note, and this is also supposed to be motivating for us, I think, that biblical literalists who don't like, who find discussions of ancient Earth contradictory to their account of creation, have interesting strategies for dealing with the science of ancient Earth, including, radiometric dating, which puts the accretion of the planet far earlier than we find in the book of Genesis. And what they do, and you might say they're in bad faith, but what they do is argue that we can't, because nobody was there to see the initial conditions of the Earth, because it wasn't witnessable, we can't say that from our observations today, which assume the conditions that we have today, we can't retroject the conditions of observation today to this origin point, because nobody was there to witness it. And so Mayo-Su notes that these sort of anti-science irrationalists and correlationists find themselves inhabiting the same like epistemic bed. They're strange bedfellows, and but the logic that they're using is the same. So the idea is if you say, well, but the radiometric dating I'm looking at says that this object is 1.2 billion years old, the literalist will say, well, that just assumes that the rate of decay has been constant from the time that of origin to now, but you can't say that with any certainty, and therefore we should at least admit that your account is as at least uncertain, and therefore that leaves room for the possibility that my account is as good. And it's really fun to go down the rabbit hole of these sort of biblical literalists and how they argue about radiometric dating. It's a good time, so I recommend it. So this is Levi Bryant commenting on how Mayo-Su understands this idea of ancestral events and the evidence for such events. Mayo-Su refers to archaefossils and fossil matter as not simply materials indicating the traces of past life in the sense of our familiar understanding of fossil, but also as materials indicating the existence of ancestral realities or events anterior to all life. And it is, so according to Mayo-Su, it's like the archaefossils and what they indicate, these ancestral events, that the correlationist who wants to be a realist and believes themselves to be at least compatible with realism can't explain or account for. An archaefossil is thus not an ancestral being like the Big Bang in the flesh, but is rather something like the radioactive decay of isotopes that allows us to infer the ancestral or that which precedes all life. Mayo-Su's question is thus twofold. On the one hand, he asks, under what conditions are these statements meaningful? On the other hand, more fundamentally, how must the correlationist interpret these statements? And for my purposes, I'm really interested in the way that Mayo-Su and Levi Bryant's interpretation of Mayo-Su keep intact a correlationist account of evidence. So evidence and indication will be correlational because they are going to require and be indexed to the activity of a knower and they're going to be dependent on the recognition of some investigator. But the Big Bang, the in the flesh, right, are those in principle unwitnessable events. And so what we still have that opposition between an immediate given and something that indicates or evidences its presence, and that survives long after the event. So he's maintaining a correlational account of evidence, but disputing a correlational account of events. And I think that's important, and he's wrong here on his own terms. So just really quickly, I want to emphasize that correlationism is a theory of evidence, right? Because, and this is really exemplified in Husserl's distinction between indication and expression, because correlationism, its foundational value is that of an immediate given, something that can be witnessed and present to some observer. And indication, as smoke is a classic example of indication, smoke indicates fire, right? And so indicative evidence, as opposed to immediate givenness, is understood as requiring the associational activity or some sort of cognitive activity on the part of the reader or experiencer. So the difference between, and this is quoting from my book, the difference between indication and expression is it lies in the sort of evidentiary warrant that each gives. Givenness, which refers to immediacy, is self-evident. Indication requires some web of associations and empirical correlation. So correlationism comes with an entire theory of evidence, and Mayo-Su never questions that at all, even though he wants to go after correlationism or show that there's something beyond it or motivate us to move past it. So I think this is an oversight. On the left, you have an image of, I think, the decay of potassium. And so the way we date things is to check up on the daughters, the it decays and we can, it happens at a set period. And so we look at how many daughters there are of that in that process. So Mayo Su keeps events and, or rather wants to understand extracorrelational instances as events and uses evidence in correlational terms. So ancestral events are extracorrelational instances. Archaefossils are evidence or indications of such events that must remain meaningless for the correlationist. So that's his argument. Like, this evidence can't be meaningful for you because you're a correlationist and you can't accept that there would be evidence for these non-correlational events. But must the archaeofossil not also be defined, that's my argument, in extracorrelational terms? Like, just as the event is extracorrelational in Mayo Su's terms, like, wouldn't we want to say that and don't we need to be able to say that the basis of radiometric dating, for example, this decay of potassium, doesn't depend at all on a knower who comes along and recognizes or creates some sort of, or rests some sort of associational pattern from what they're seeing. In order for there to be these kinds of like absolute events, there also has to be, in principle, absolute evidence of those events. And therefore, evidence and not just events must be defined non-correlationally or as absolute. Evidences beyond the human. And this is where I think Derrida just like comes in really nicely, because otherwise you wouldn't, there's no real reason why you would think, oh, I need to start talking about texts in order to talk about extracorrelational instances. But I think Derrida sees right away that it's like not, he goes after right away in Speech and Phenomenon. By right away, I mean 1967, like one of his first things that he goes after, and because he thinks we need this to understand even text in the narrow sense of language, we need to go after this distinction between givenness and indication. So he sees right away that what we need is not a non-correlational account of events, but that of evidence or texts. So I've shown you some tree rings. My book cover also has the tree rings. I think the tree rings they're a perfectly good indication of what we mean by texts. They're just differential traces that encode other differences. I'll talk more about that. So the classic image of a posthumous text, a text without readers, though not any possible readers, is Egyptian hieroglyphics or cuneiform, right? Like, so the idea is it's like a sort of symbol of an orphaned script or text that, at least for until there's a discovery of something like a Rosetta Stone, will be unreadable, right? And so Derrida, from the origin of geometry, is really interested in the symbol of unreadable texts. So posthumous texts, like ancestral events for Mayo Su, are defined in non-correlational terms. So Derrida writes, and this is from Signature Event Context, 1971, in order for my written communication to retain its function as writing, its readability. So function is writing and readability, and the French word is lisibilité, and I'll talk about that in a second. It must remain readable despite the absolute disappearance of any receiver. So absolute disappearance, determined in general. There he wants to be like, just like, imagine there's no possible reader or receiver of this text. And that in the secondary literature tends to be deflated a lot. So it tends to be read as this or that reader, or like the temporary suspension of readers, but the sense of that Derrida is trying to talk about an extracorrelational instance is typically absent in the literature, though maybe some of you will argue that that's not true. My communication must be repeatable, iterable, in the absolute absence of the receiver or of any empirically determinable collectivity of receivers. Such iterability structures the mark of writing itself, no matter what particular type of writing is involved. A writing that is not structurally readable or iterable beyond the depth of the addressee or any imaginable addressee or all possible addressees would not be writing. I'm going to go through that really important set of remarks in the next few slides. So we're talking about conditions of readability. And again, the most natural way to think about readability, philosophically natural, is to think about readability as resting with some cognitive activity on the part of readers. And so to say that a text is readable in the absence of any possible reader makes no sense according to that correlational view, which is the most common view of how to interpret texts in reading. So lisibilité is equal between readability and legibility. So it's meant to refer to both structure and signification there. So the point isn't that, Derrida's point is not that, oh yeah, well, the text remains legible, but not readable, right? Which is a tempting reading. Like, he's not like, well, the structure is still there, but like readability is not there because there's no readers. He means both. Like, both the structure is there and the fact that the structure is there means that it's readable, because as we'll see, readability depends on not on the transcendental activity of the reader or a possible reader, but it depends on the structure of the text, which is extracorrelational and should be understood in extracorrelational terms. So Searle, who's my favorite person to hate, he has this assumption. He says, well, textual meaning has to be, there's two choices for you. Pick one, pick both. It is either determined at inception, through understanding what the author intended, or it is determined at reception, whatever the reader or audience thinks of it. And from this, he says, well, okay, well, for Jacques Derrida, meaning is a matter of, well, what? Meanings are, and here he's quoting inaccurately, undecidable and have relative indeterminacy. According to Derrida, instead of fully determinate meaning, there is rather the free play of signifiers and the grafting of texts onto texts within the textuality and intertextuality of the text. Searle's critiquing Derrida's account of textuality and intertextuality. He's attributing a certain account to Derrida. And I think it's an auspicious starting point for understanding Derrida's concept of textuality, not because it's right or accurate or careful or friendly, because it's not any of those, but because it presents with admirable economy how Derridian textuality must appear from the correlationist point of view. Like, if you think that reading is all about what goes on in the head of a reader or in the head of a writer, then to say that Derrida's account of textuality, where he talks about readability in terms of the structure of the text, or this new concept of iterability that we'll turn to, makes little sense to you. And so Searle doesn't realize that he's just a correlationist and that Derrida is not, and that's the relevant thing to focus on. He just judges Derrida's account of textuality by the very account that Derrida is in the process of rejecting. So iterability is the term Derrida proposes and introduces, which is meant to name the conditions of readability in the radical absence of author and receiver of any possible reader. So iterability should be a very unfamiliar concept to us because we didn't know we needed an account of readability in terms of the structure of the text, because we always assumed, if you're a correlationist, that that it occurred through the reader. So iterability is a kind of future concept. That's how I like to think of all of Derrida's special terms. And it's required, you feel the need for it when there is a need to describe a necessary relation between repetition and difference. So Derrida thinks that textual elements and texts exemplify a relationship where repetition and alterity are necessarily related. Why is this the case? It's the case because it's the very structure of texts. When the elements of a text are repeated, the alterity is repeated as well. In other words, texts are structured by a heterogeneous element. which structures that manifest content or the manifest structure. So they're informed forms. He talks about text as parasitic. So a form in repeating itself will repeat a heterogeneous form. You can think about in patterns, informed forms, parasitic structures. So reading text, what does reading entail now with this understanding of the structure of text? It requires you do something like a reverse translation where you pull out the pattern or the signified element in that from the surface text. And he says that this is a continuation of the quote. Maybe it's here. The iterability structures the mark of writing, right? So the mark of writing is structured by this structure of repetition and alterity, no matter what particular type of writing is involved. So there Derrida's introducing, I mean, this is signature event context, which appeared after grammatology. So he's definitely referring back to a project in which he tries to show that textuality or writing is not at all limited to literary artifacts or the artifacts of knowers and human subjects. So the structure of textuality that I'm talking about is not limited to literary or linguistic texts, to human artifacts. I think it is the starting point. It's a promising starting point for a speculative account of the structure of information. And I think that there's really interesting insights to be gleaned connecting Derrida's account of grammatology with some other accounts of information that we get from around the same time and within French philosophy, like Simondon, for example, who is also very interested in information. Whose account of information I suspect is like proceeds along similar lines. It allows us to talk about patterns of scientific discovery in new ways. So we can provide descriptions of how science proceeds or works under a new description, whereas before we would have focused on, or we habitually talk about the inferential activity of the scientists, we can now talk about the scientists as reading or translating marks. And so the example that I give, I think I have time to look at it, so I can tell you what I mean. So I spend a lot of time in the book with an example of the dendrochronologist, which is the person who reads tree rings. So I'll just read from that section of the book. So it comes in around page 60, which is almost the end of the chapter. Let us return to the example of the dendrochronologist. We're coming to it for the first time, who finds in one of the central, that is the oldest rings of a tree, a spike of carbon-14. How shall we describe the pattern of discovery? Shall we say that the scientist sees the spike as an indicative sign by linking the presence of carbon-14 in her head to the known efflux of solar flares, and then inferring that a solar flare happened, say 250 years ago, because that's how it works, right? So you look at the tree rings and you're like, oh, there's relatively more carbon-14 absorbed in this tree ring than in other tree rings, and that has been correlated with solar flares. So we can look at the tree rings and say, oh, this is a record of, among other things, solar flares. And so there's one way to describe it in which you really focus on this sort of inferential activity of the scientist, the dendrochronologist. And the description that I just provided to you is perfectly plausible. There's another description possible, however. We can also say that the scientist reads the solar flare in the carbon-14 markers. What is the difference in the two descriptions? Is one more apt than the other? What is seeing and what is reading? The carbon-14 can function as a marker or indication of something because it is already differentially present in the tree rings. Each distinct tree ring, we have learned, marks a terrestrial year of tree life. This clear demarcation makes the tree a sort of almanac or archive. The differential pattern of carbon absorption in each ring records the differential quantities of carbon in the atmosphere each year. The differential marks of carbon are already spatially and temporally structured, without which they could not be read in the first place. These differences, or carbon marks, we might suggest form a text within the text of the tree rings. The burst in carbon, which we find spaced, let us say in ring 12, that is the difference between it and the surrounding carbon marks, is the trace of the solar flare event. Indeed, the distinction between the trace of the event and the event now seems problematic. Surely the absorption and retention of the carbon-14 is part of the event, and this is part of this critique of Meillassoux, who separates out evidence from events. One of the fallouts of that critique. Minimally, this textual description motivates more theoretical attention to the structure of evidentiary traces, while the competing description assumes that the structuring activity happens in the associational activity of the scientists. There is, of course, much more in this living record or archive of the tree. For example, differences in the width of the tree rings signify differences in lengths of growing seasons. What makes something a significant mark or indication is, first of all, the presence of other marks, a differential pattern. What makes these marks textual in Derrida's sense is that the form or pattern is informed by a heterogeneous pattern. Scientific discovery does not amount to adding to these marks their transcendent meaning, but learning to read what informs these marks. So what we've done, or what I've done in this briefer than anticipated presentation is, I was worried about time, we've tracked a movement from ancestral events, which, as we saw in Meillassoux, are seemingly opposed to evidence for these events, which he thinks the correlationists can't account for, to this notion of absolute evidence or textuality. And we did this by sort of identifying, agreeing with Meillassoux about the contours of the problem and about this idea of extra correlational instances being interesting and philosophically productive, but noting that what we really need is not some account of extra correlational events. We need an account of extra correlational or absolute evidence. I argue that grammatology, or I've suggested that grammatology or Derridean textuality is the generalization of this idea of absolute evidence. So, well, first, there's a textuality is this idea of absolute evidence or evidentiary traces. Grammatology is the project which attempts to generalize this idea of absolute evidence or textuality. In other words, it says everything is or can be understood or can be described as an evidentiary trace. And though I haven't done so yet, I think that this is a suitable framework to pursue the sorts of accounts of devolved agencies that new materialisms, for example, Karen Barad or Elizabeth Wilson, aim for, right? Because readers and writers no longer have to be human type knowers. And I think that this account could also be useful for post-human ontologies or epistemologies, because as we can see, we don't need humans to understand or read texts. The kind of movement of translation does not require a human knower and can happen in the absence of human knowers. And at the rate we're going, that's at least some sort of hope for a future without us, that there will still be reading and writing without us. And this presentation is exerted from my speculative grammatology, which technically came out in December of 2020, but is copyrighted for 2021. And I'm happy to share more parts of that work if you email me. And I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Debbie. That was really good. I really enjoyed that.
I'm going to stop presenting. I hope if I leave, I'll try to come back.